So we have our border strips all cut and pieced together, and I'm going to show you how to piece them onto the quilt. But I'm going to use a rather small quilt, so I want you to try to understand why this is important, especially when you have a larger quilt. So with this block, I'm going to pretend this is a whole quilt, and instead of knowing it's 16.5 inches because we just cut it, I actually want to measure it. So I've got a tape measure here that's 120 inches because a king-size quilt is never going to be more than 120 inches. So you want to be sure that for your quilt supplies, you have 120-inch measuring tape, not a 60-inch. It won't do the job. So I'm going to measure the quilt, and I'm going to measure it 3 times, never at the very edge of the quilt, always coming in a few inches or the block size that the quilt is. So this measures 16.5, and oh my goodness, 16.5 and 16.5. So I kind of cheated. But let's imagine that you're measuring a king-size quilt. There's a very good possibility that you're going to measure that quilt without the borders, and you're going to get like a 90, 92, and 94 inches on your quilt. And if you've made any quilts, you've already seen it happen, that the quilt does not end up all exactly square. Putting on the border is the way to make that quilt square or rectangular like you want it. So you're going to measure the quilt at least 3 times. If the variation in the measurements is more than 1/2 inch, then you want to take an average of that measurement. So back to the king-size quilt, if I measured 92, 94, and 95 inches, I would add those 3 together and divide it by 3. That would give me the size measurement that I want to cut my borders. In the case of this little block, I want to cut it 16.5 inches. So I've got my strips. I've got 4 strips that are long enough because I'm going to do cornerstones, so they all have to be the same size. And I'm going to fold it in half. Half of 16.5 inches is 8.25 inches. Now, seriously, you know that I did not have to do this with this. I've got a ruler that is 24 inches long. I could have just measured the full 16.5 inches, but I want to show you this method because when you're doing a 90-inch border, you don't have a 90-inch ruler to cut with. So I fold it in half, and then I only have to measure 45 inches. So I might use the full length of my cutting board. I might use 2 or 3 rulers lined up together, but it's a lot easier to come up with 45 inches than it is 90 inches. So for this quilt, I'm going to actually fold it in half like I would on a larger quilt. Line it up, the fold at the 8.25 inches, and come over here to cut and stop. And go, wait a minute, I really should measure another time just to be sure. So I'm going to measure it one more time, and I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.25 inches. 8.25 inches times 2 is 16.5 inches. That's the measurement. And cut. So now I have 4 strips of fabric that are 16.5 inches long. And on this quilt, they're going to go around the quilt. And because this particular border is going to be done with cornerstones, the strips of fabric are all the same. And then my little cornerstone squares, I cut those 1.5 inches. So those are going to be the corners of my quilt. All right? So now it's time to pin the borders on. You might have noticed that there's sometimes that I don't pin. I just kind of take it to the sewing machine and I will just sew without pinning. When it comes to borders, never. Never, ever do I sew a border on without pinning it. And I pin it a lot. So I'm going to go a little extreme because this is such a small piece, and you're probably thinking, yeah, she doesn't really need to pin it that much. You're right. On a small piece, I don't need to pin it that much, but I'm going to go a little extreme because I want you to imagine this is a large quilt. And remember on that king-size measurement that we made? What if the edge of the quilt is 94 inches and your average measurement was 92.5 inches? That means you need to ease in an extra 1.5 inches along that 90 inches. You're going to need a lot of pins to make that happen. So I always start with a pin at the left side, come over, put a pin at the right side. Now on a little quilt like this, I can just hold it and come right to the middle. On a bigger king-size quilt, you might need a friend to help catch it in the middle. You can mark your borders where the middle of the border is and where the middle of the quilt is. A lot of different ways to do it. But what's important is that you put lots of pins in to make everything stay in place. So I've got my pins on this, and I'm going to go to my sewing machine. Now at my sewing machine, I have it set up with the normal stitch length of the 2.5 inches. I'm going to use, on this machine, I can actually find my memory stitch in a second here. There we go. So I've moved it over so that it's to the 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to put my little seam guide on it now for sewing my 1/4 inch. Lower my foot, add my seam guide to it. So now my needle is a 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and my little seam guide is going to help me keep the seam allowance at the scant 1/4 of an inch that we've been sewing with. And now we're going to sew. So I'm going to start right here. And I'm going to, oh my goodness, sew over the pin. I know, all the home ec teachers on the planet are just really having a fit right now because I just sewed over the pin. Honestly, I think it's okay. When I sew over the pin, I'm going nice and slow. I'm not trying to go really fast. And with the guidelines seam guide that I have here, it's short enough that my pin can very easily just slide right over the top of the seam guide. As I come to my pin, I go a little slower, then I can pick up my tempo and continue. Get to the end and cut. Now we're going to press it. One of the reasons I have a big board like this for doing my pressing on is because when you're making larger quilts, you need to have this long distance so that you can press the quilt nice and straight. If you're trying to use a seamstress ironing board with the little angle that comes to the point, it just is a lot harder to do. An ironing board like this is just going to make the process easier. All right? So my border is on. I'm going to have the quilt top up. I'm going to set my seam first. I always like to flatten everything out. Then I'm going to flip up the border and finger press it first. And now slide the iron over. Patiently pressing it. Always looking to the back side, making sure that everything is nice and smooth on the back side. So I have those two sides sewed on and pressed. And now it's time to add the top and the border. And with these, we're going to have these little cornerstones in it. So I need to go and sew those little cornerstones on before I can show you the next step. So now I have my cornerstones sewed onto the edges of the ends of this border, but I want to show you something important on the pressing of it. On this quilt, and generally speaking, almost all the time, you're going to press out toward the borders. So that means that when you're pressing your cornerstones to your border, you actually have to press toward the border. And for some reason that seems odd to people, to be pressing toward the larger piece, but you need to do that so you're able to actually butt these seams together. So I'm going to press this and come back and pin it in place. So I've got my cornerstones sewed onto my top and bottom border. Now I'm going to flip that over, and with the seams being pressed in on the border and out on the quilt, I'm able to take that and it will butt right together, so they'll snug right together, and I'll put my pin in. Then I'll come to the other side. Same thing, it's going to just slide right in there, snuggle together, put my pin in, find my middle, and two sides. So generally speaking, even on a large quilt, I'm going to put my pins so that they're no more than 3 or 4 inches apart. I'm not going to put a pin every 12 inches. You need more pins than that. Otherwise, your quilt is going to shift underneath the border piece that you put on. So now we're going to go sew this over here. When you're sewing, anytime there's a seam, you just want to be cautious that the underneath seam here actually stays pressed the way that you wanted it. So I'm being sure that one's pressing away from me. Sew up to that seam. And go. Slowing down when it comes to a pin. And go. And here again, I want to match up, make sure that my seams are butted right together and that the seam does not flip up as I'm sewing over it. And cut. Then I'm going to go to the iron. Same thing, always setting my seam first. Then flip it up and press it. When we come back, I'm going to show you how to put on a horizontal border. So we have the first borders on. After your first border is on, you now have to measure again for the second border. I know it sounds repetitive. You're thinking, why can't I just know that I've added 1.5 inches to each side? Please trust me on this. You need to do the measuring. If you want your quilt to end up without having waffly borders, I believe that it requires measuring the quilt each time you put a border on it. So I'm going to take and now I'm going to measure the 2 sides of the quilt. So now this is measuring 18.5 inches. Again, going to the center, 18.5. And 18.5. And remember, this is a small block. Yeah, this didn't change, but when it's a larger quilt, it very well might. So now I'm going to take my strips of border, so I have my 2 long strips here for that measurement, and I'm going to cut them together. It just makes sense that if I want the left side and the right side to be the same size, that I actually cut them at the same time. So I need 18.5 inches. Half of 18.5 is 9.25. So from the fold, I'm going to go 9.25, and I'm going to cut. No, I'm not. I really need to double check my measurement. The first time you don't double check your measurement, you'll cut it wrong and you'll go, oh, that's right. Nancy said I should at least once double check my measurement. So my fold is on the inside. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.25. 9.25 times 2 is 18.5 inches. Now I can cut. So now I have my 2 strips that are 18.5 inches for the sides of my quilt. And I'm going to go sew those on and come right back. So now we have our 2 horizontal borders on, so going the length of the fabric on the 2 sides, and now it's time to measure again. But this time when we're measuring, we're going to include those borders in our measurement. So going all the way across, I've got 23 3/4, 23 3/4, and 23 and actually a little bit short of 3/4, but we're going to go with 23 3/4. This is a point in time that I would actually need to have a calculator, because I'm sitting here as I'm folding this fabric, trying for the life of me to figure out what's half of 23 3/4. I have no idea, and I don't have a calculator, so how about this little trick? Take your ruler, your measuring tape, 23 3/4. I folded it in half, and I've got my end right at the 23 3/4. Here's my fold. Half of 23 3/4 is 11 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 eighths. So 11 and 7 eighths on my ruler. 1, 2, 3, there's 11. 7 eighths is the one little mark short of 12. And I'm going to cut. No, I'm not. I'm going to double check my measurement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11. And 7/8 times 2 would be 23 3/4. Now I'm going to pin this onto the quilt. Then I'm going to sew it, and then we'll come back. So now our little quilt is all done. We have our first border using the cornerstones in it, and then we have the traditional horizontal border to finish this out. When we come back, I'm going to show you these techniques used on the Learning to Quilt quilt. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our channel. We wouldn't want you to miss a single show. Please share us with your friends and leave a comment. We would really love to hear from you.